thank you for the introduction, Marina. And I won't repeat all the names, but thank you to everyone that Marina mentioned for bringing me here and organizing this, and especially Felicity Tayler, who I understand had organized and initiated this visit with the masterclass yesterday and with the lecture. I didn't know that it was talked about, my visiting Montreal was talked about even before by other people, so now I feel like the pressure is really on. And also, thank you all for coming. And although I think I said in advance that I was going to talk specifically about the group material book, I've changed my mind and have thought about the fact that probably some of you here are familiar with my practice to some degree, and some of you may not be. So I'm dividing the talk into two parts. And the first part is going to be more introductory and give you some snapshots of some of the different facets of my practice. And then the second part, I'll go into more depth into one aspect, and that's recent work, which is the making of the group material publication. But also that in itself is nested within a larger research, which was my PhD studies, and that has to do with archiving and historical representation. And there's an exhibition that went along with that that's also up now, so I'll talk about these things more in depth. If we have time, I realize that I've organized an insane amount of material and it will be hard to get through it, but we'll see how it goes. The other thing is I would invite you to ask questions. If there's something that is immediate to what I'm talking about and makes sense to ask at the time, that's fine. Otherwise, if there's let's say, questions that develop that are not immediate and that are more abstract or whatever, or more questions furthering into the practice, we can talk about that afterwards. I wear a lot of different hats as an artist, as I think you got a sense of in the introduction that Marina gave. Some of that I'm going to repeat. I'm an artist, but within that I'm also working curatorially. I write, I'm editing publications, also working as an exhibition designer from time to time, and that's almost always in collaboration with Martin Beck, another artist who is my sometimes artistic partner as well. And I'm also think of myself as an educator. The images that I'm going to show you in the first section are snapshots into these different, kind of aspects of practice. I've worked collaboratively and independently and continue to work both collaboratively and solo because I like both ways of working and they feed each other. So I've never subscribed to the idea that you have to choose really, and I find that it's really rewarding and I can accomplish things and think through things collaboratively that I wouldn't be able to do on my own. But I also enjoy that process of internal work and making decisions on my own as well. That said, though, dialogue either in form or content is sort of at the core of all the work that I do, and you'll see that probably through some of the projects. The first collaboration, or my coming of age as an artist, was really in the nested within Group Material, this artist collaborative in New York that we founded. And Group Material initiated from a group of friends. I was one of them, friends and friends of friends. There were about 10 of us in 1979, all living in lower Manhattan. And we formed the group to combine our social and aesthetic interests, which at the time was something that was kept more separate than it is now. I think some of the boundaries or like false dichotomy between aesthetics and politics has been broken down now, but at the time it meant something, to announce that we were fusing these interests into a practice. And we were interested in forging a collective production to also make a space for self-representation, to represent ourselves as artists and as thinkers and as cultural activists, and to foreground issues in our work and respond to topical social issues rather than to market issues, etc. So in the original group, there might be some names you are familiar with. Tim Rollins was a big force of the original group, one of the founding members. Also Mundy McLaughlin, Patrick Brennan, Michael Udvardy. Later on in the group, Doug Ashford joined in 1981, and later on Felix Gonzalez-Torres was part of the group for several years, and Karen Ramsbacher. Painters Thomas Eggerer and Jochen Klein joined the group as well. Most of the life of Group Material was a small group. It was 3 or 4 people. Initially, though, it was 10 to 13 loosely, and we rented a space on the Lower East Side in New York in order to have a kind of concrete laboratory, an exhibition laboratory, and a place where we could basically figure out our agendas and how we could work together and test some of our ideas in public. After that first year, and the first year was quite compelling, we were really, fired up and excited. And after that first year, we morphed into a group of 3 as basically different, members of the group fell away and decided on taking up other modes of production and other work. But once it morphed into this smaller group and Group Material gave up the idea of a fixed space to work, we decided to work in the public sphere more, so working in subways, newspapers, with billboards, and renting advertising space in order to present art or artistic projects, and also working in a way where we parasited onto established institutions from all kinds of levels, from alternative spaces in the city to university galleries to museums eventually. And so we had a fairly nomadic practice for most of the life of the group. Group Material's production was ephemeral. The main, I suppose, medium that we developed was the temporary exhibition. And also we used different modes like town meetings and roundtable discussions, and authored situations for the investigation of a particular social theme. Let's see, I'll give you a very small snapshot of Group Material, because we'll go into Group Material more when we look at the book. But to give you an example of these 2 ways of working, one in what I would call public space, or sometimes thought of as advertising space in public. This was a project, Dazzy Bows, on Union Square, 1981, where the group, this was after we didn't have our own space anymore, and we basically went out and interviewed people on the street in Union Square about some of the very urgent social issues of that moment, and then took those interviews and edited down, chose a set of statements that we wanted to present. And simultaneously with interviewing people on the street, we also put out the same questions about these issues. And the issues at the time were reproductive rights. This was 1981 or 82, so we were talking about reproductive rights. We were talking about U.S. intervention in El Salvador and in Central and South America. We were talking about crime. We were talking about drug use. Various issues that were really in the news at the time and were pertinent. And we were also talking about cultural funding, and that was an issue that was, believe it or not, on the table at the time. So we interviewed people, and then we also contacted a number of organizations to ask them for statements. And the organizations were people or entities that were dealing with these very issues. So for instance, about U.S. intervention in Central America, we worked with CISBASE, the Center, oh gosh, now it's skipping my mind. It's an advocacy organization for the people of El Salvador. For working with the issue of reproductive rights, we contacted Planned Parenthood for a statement. And then what we did was to enlarge or blow up these statements. The private statements are the ones in red, and the organizational statements are the ones in yellow, and created a kind of opinion landscape that we mounted illegally on a defunct department store in Union Square. And this stayed up for a couple of months, of course. So this is an example of Group Materials wanting to work in the public sphere. And of course, the art sphere is also, or art institutions are also public, but to work outside and then to also work within interior exhibition halls. And then just a snapshot of this other way of working, the thematic exhibitions that Group Material organized really saw or considered the exhibition to be a forum where a number of different voices would come together to discuss visually and theoretically sometimes, but to make a kind of visual forum in which a articulation of a theme would take place. So this theme was Constitution and was done on the anniversary of the Constitution in the US. And as you see, I think this illustrates this image that the exhibitions did not sort of feature individual artists, but they made a whole artwork in a sense, right? There's a curatorial element, of course, in organizing these exhibitions. What Group Material was trying to do with these temporal exhibitions and the kind of pose models, I would say, of representational structures, and also to take up these themes as ways of presenting a forum for participation, right? So to come at a theme from many different angles, not only our own thinking, the individual members of the group. So in addition to, that's just a real short picture of Group Material, but in addition to Group Material, I've been working collaboratively, as I said, in other constellations. The most ongoing of that is with Martin Beck, and also working with Jan Vo, who I think you mentioned I had done a publication with somewhat recently, and working with the filmmaker James Benning. And what happens with me is that I often I would say that my work is somewhat research-driven, and particularly, was within Group Material, but also afterwards. And I often find a subject that I'm interested in investigating, but also sometimes find a sensibility that I'm interested in joining to. And so that sometimes elicits a collaboration, like the one with Martin Beck, that's been going on for over 10 years now, I think 12 or 13 years. When Group Material ended in 1996, I had been putting my energies, my artistic energies, actually most of my energies, into Group Material for the entire life of the group, for 17 years. So when it ended, I was in a quandary, in a sense, of how to redefine my practice or to reinvent a practice that is without the group. And the first project that I did to that end was called Cultural Economies, Histories from the Alternative Arts Movement, which took place at the Drawing Center. It was an exhibition project that also led to a book, but the impetus for it was I was interested in investigating this larger context that Group Material had been part of, because the group was part of a moment, in a sense, right, or a burgeoning of, I would say, alternative activity, the creation of lots of alternative structures and nonprofit structures in New York. And I wanted to look into that larger context and analyze the relationships between alternative and mainstream, analyze the dynamics between the different sectors of the art industry or the art field at that time. So that first project was a kind of research into the larger context that Group Material had taken form within and also been a part of and contributed to, but also that I was coming of age as an artist in. So the whole field of, I would say, alternative but also contestational practices that were important came out of the late 60s and were particularly important in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s and continue, but were really legible as a field at that point. So that was something I wanted to look at. And out of that project eventually came a book project, Alternative Art New York. This is several years later. And while I was working on that project, I decided the field needed, or I felt that the field needed to be articulated in a way that could be documented and lasting, right? And to analyze that field. So again, briefly, just to also show the different ways of working, because I've been working between exhibition and publication and other forms for a while, and partly that's because my practice involves, by definition, a kind of diverse relationship to form, and thinking through what kind of form is desirable and effective for a certain purpose, for a certain situation. But also I keep a flexile approach to form, I suppose, to keep the work interesting for myself, and remaining open and flexible allows me to learn through working. You know, so when I've been working on exhibitions, sometimes that leads to a publication, and it's not that I had experience in publications, but wanted to also learn how to activate that form and use it as a platform. So the book, Alternative Art New York, was the first book project that I had worked on independently, and where I functioned as an editor, which meant conceptualizing the scope of the book, what the subject terrain was, and then commissioning authors, working with authors, organizing the contents, and then organizing a publishing context as well, so that it would happen, and put it together. Then I talked about this, this idea of joining to different sensibilities. After working in, beginning to work on my own, I was also, I suppose, in a post-group material mode, I was also thinking about new models for myself, right? And what kind of artist I was interested in looking at, and mentors, in effect. And I was interested in investigating this artist, Sister Corita Kent, and also putting her work in a kind of dynamic with an artist named Donald Moffat. And I'll tell you a little bit about both of them. But Sister Corita, this is an image of Sister Corita's. Sister Corita was a Catholic nun, a printmaker, and an art teacher at the Immaculate Heart in Los Angeles. And I came across Sister Corita's work and was really struck by the way she playfully recasts advertising slogans and uses them for spiritual and sometimes political content. And in this case, what it says is, "Come alive, tomorrow the stars." This is an example of her recasting advert slogans. "Come alive, you're in the Pepsi generation" was at the time, this is from 1964, this print, was at the time a very popular slogan, right, from Pepsi. For many years, I've ended up engaging Corita's work and found, this is one of the exhibitions that I did with her work, found her work to be an endless kind of a well of inspiration, in the sense that she brought together a kind of political conviction, graphic innovation, and color and playfulness, and also a very honest voice to her work. And also she was an incredible educator. So for this project, Power Up, Come Alive, Sister Corita and Donald Moffat interlocking, I wanted to look at Sister Corita's work in relation to Donald Moffat. And Corita's work was specifically from the 60s that I was bringing together. And Donald Moffat is an artist who came of age in the 80s and is an artist, AIDS activist, graphic designer, and was a member of the Design Team Bureau with Marlene McCarty for many years. And Moffat's work seemed to me to somehow make a really interesting almost clash, but also continuity with Corita's work. And so I brought them together into this exhibition, and I became the third artist, in a sense. So it was Corita, Donald, and then me as the one who organizes and conceptualizes. But also, as you see, there's a very kind of vivid or legible hand in there in my participation. So unlike a kind of curatorial objectivity, I'm bringing display and making the display of their works as a kind of discourse that constitutes me as the third artist in the exhibition. Again, I have to kind of just give snapshots because I want you to get almost the visual flavor of the work that I've been doing, but then I'll go deeper into one project or two projects. Also with Corita, I've done a lot of exhibition work with her work, but then I also wanted to at a certain point, bring it into publication. And one of the reasons for this is that I've found over the last few years, most of the time I've been working ephemerally, and I've found that even though exhibition, for instance, with Sister Carita, broadcast her work to a number of people, there was no book on her work. And to me, she was a very inspiring artist, and I couldn't understand how she wasn't entered into art history in a sense, right? Or some angle of art history. And so the idea of doing a book was something that lingered for a while as a way to broadcast her work and to bring, well, to examine her work so that it could be in a lasting way and circulate beyond what an exhibition can do. So the book was by this publisher, Four Corners, which Marina mentioned, which is a very interesting publisher in London-based because they work only on a very small number of books, and they're quite artist-centered, and they work with books that are usually to do with either an artist project or a curatorial project. So the Carita book is different, for instance, uses a very different mode than the one on the alternative arts milieu had, because that used a university press and was a more scholarly undertaking in order to, for one thing, to bring those histories that were in danger of being forgotten or disappearing because of their marginality or being, historically marginalized, and to bring those histories into a lasting record that also had a certain authority in the academic press. And with Carita, I also then thought about what kind of book would make sense for Carita, and I wanted it to be a kind of large-scale monograph that would really look at the prints that she had done and also to contextualize her work her work really took place within this community of the Immaculate Heart, the Immaculate Heart in Los Angeles. And what my text in this book does is to look at the collaboration that kind of underpinned her artistic practice and study that a bit. You see some of her prints in in these images. Then, keeping on the vein of books a little bit, to show you the variety and also the idea of using the book as an open form. So, for instance, I'm not interested in working with books in a kind of standard way or formulaic way, but in looking at a book as an opportunity to create a very particular visual and structure, etc., for a particular subject. This is, oh yeah, okay, you can read that. Oh, by the way, I apologize for the quality of the images. They look a little bit better on my screen, but we realized that with the projection, it's not so great. The Felix Gonzalez Torres book, I put that title because here's an example of the not so great projection. But this is the cover of the book, and it's illegible here, but it's actually a quite subtle cover that is an image of one of the stacks of paper that Felix Gonzalez Torres made, a blue stack and of paper, and then it says his name and then edited by me underneath. So the book on Felix has a very different sensibility. I won't go into it. I'd also want to talk then more about Felix's work per se, but as an example of activating the publication format. Okay. Then, this is Points of Entry, which was done a few years ago, is the only permanent project that I've ever made, permanent art project, which was a commissioned permanent work for CUNY. And this project was quite different, but also speaks to the idea of research and to the notion of how to materialize things that aren't, in this case it's quotations, but to materialize things that are difficult to exhibit. And I want to find... This is Powdermaker Hall. It's a humanities building at Queens College in CUNY in New York, part of the City University of New York. And the humanities building was being renovated several years back, and so there was an opportunity to have art projects as part of the new architecture. And the building in the past had been very much a kind of not user-friendly building and needed to be turned into something that was more habitable. And with that came this opportunity to do something for the building. And what I did was to think about the character of the university, in particular Queen's College, which is quite a polyglot constituency, of student constituency, and to think about the CUNY program, the CUNY system, and the open access of the university system, the state system. And the project I wanted to take this idea of the motto, or the kind of, you know, like at Harvard or different kinds of educational institutions or courthouses, you'll have a motto often at the entrance, or a maxim that proclaims, you know, the goal of either the law or education. And I wanted to take that idea of the maxim that you see at the entrance of an institution and turn it into something like a dialogue of different quotations, different maxims, between people that are associated with cultural pedagogy and thinking about education for democracy, or for cultural democracy. I need my glasses for this. So on the beginning, at the entrance to the building, I installed two quotations. The first one is, the two quotations flank the entrance. The first one is from Bell Hooks, and it reads, "The academy is not paradise, but learning is a place where paradise can be created." And then on the other side of that entrance is, says education is inherently an ethical and political act. And that's from Michael Apple, who is an educator. So what I did was to do a lot of reading and comb a lot of books that were written about cultural pedagogy and about radical education, and search for quotations that would be open-ended in the sense that they would make one think over time, or would function not so much as a slogan or something you could take in really quickly, but something that in dialogue with other quotations would situate the people that use the building a lot, which is students and faculty, and of course is always changing, but help to situate in this kind of interrogation of education itself. Right? I'll read you a couple more of those. When you first walk in to the lobby, and this is a very large building, I don't know, I can't remember the details of the building, but it houses 13 different departments and is really used a lot, and has something like 16 different entrances. So I was able to use 12 of the entrances. And this one is from Paulo Freire. This is when you first walk in. It says, "Education for domestication is an act of transferring knowledge, whereas education for freedom is an act of knowledge and a process of transforming action that should be exercised on reality." And then across from that, all these quotations always appeared in couples, in a sense, like to make a kind of call and response or duet, and to put forward the dialogue. And across from that is a quotation from Michel Foucault, which says, "Thought is no longer theoretical. As soon as it functions, it offends or reconciles, attracts or repels, breaks, disassociates, unites or reunites. It cannot help but liberate and enslave." And it was very interesting, this process of making the work, because I was working with the architect and also with the Dean of Humanities. And the Dean of Humanities, he kept asking me, "Can you make it even more radical? You know, could you possibly make it more Foucauldian?" And then there were other professors, though, who were also sending me different quotations to look at. So there was a dialogue within the department, the humanities department, about it. And the architect, of course, was, well, I say of course, but he was interested in me bringing something that would be more colorful. So he kept asking, "Could you do them in neon? Or could you maybe paint the background of the wall or something?" Because he was hoping that the art would liven things up a little, and he had done a very, you know, kind of just nice renovation. And anyway, he came around and he was quite supportive of it. But what I wanted to do in this case was to use the stainless steel lettering that is used by the school for their own signage. And it's almost like, you know, just being able to, so that people could assume that the quotations were put up by the institution itself, right? That this dialogue was a part of the institution. And it's not so much to hide that it's an artwork, but to infiltrate that, right? And to use the authority of the signage that is already there. This ended up being, of course, quite expensive, you know, to have these stainless steel letters made. That one, in case you couldn't read it in the back, it says, "Passionate teaching, like all teaching, is necessarily a social process, not just an individual performance." Robert L. Fried. And I put that in one of the kind of back entrances that is used a lot by the faculty, because I thought it would be a nice reminder. And then another entrance is a great quotation from Ira Shore, who's a wonderful thinker, and it says, "Not encouraging students to question knowledge, society, and experience tacitly endorses and supports the status quo." Then there was another one from James Baldwin, "The world is before you and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in." And another one from John Dewey, "Any experience, however trivial in its first appearance, is capable of assuming an indefinite richness of significance by extending its range of perceived connections." So these were a few. There were actually 12 in all. And that's a kind of another example of the working. And then this other practice, or another dimension of the practice that I've been doing, is working with Martin Beck, who maybe some of you have met or heard. I know he was in Montreal, I think last year, I can't remember exactly when, speaking about his work. And also he was involved in the exhibition design recently in an exhibition at the CCA. And Martin and I have a collaboration for about 12 years, and we do a couple of different things together. One is to work on projects that or to co-author projects that are artistic projects. And then the other thing, which this is an example of, and the other thing is to work on exhibition design together. And this one, very briefly, Social Landscape, I also show it because I think it's an example of how to give visual form to information that is somewhat intangible, right? So this project was about the poverty line in the US. We took the US governmental poverty line as our research subject, and it was for a show called Born of Necessity, which was investigating poverty, right? And we wanted to do this piece that was actually something you would see before you enter the show. So it was on the wall outside of the gallery space, the kind of exterior wall of the exhibition hall where the exhibition took place. The poverty line, I don't know how it works in Canada, but the poverty line in the US is a concrete and symbolic parameter that's used for judging the financial eligibility for people for federal assistance programs, right? So it's very important. It's also used for preparing statistical estimates of the number of Americans living in poverty and for measuring the country's economic well-being. And the poverty line is something that's referred to all the time. And as we were invited to do this project in an exhibition on poverty, we realized we really didn't understand how the poverty line works. So that was the impetus for the project in the first place, was to develop an understanding for ourselves and then to share that research in an exhibition or in a visual form in this work. So the methods of it's a longer story and quite interesting actually to go into the poverty line, but the methods of that the US uses for determining how many people are living in poverty have been contested since the inception of the poverty line in 1963. And it's complicated to go into the data for the purpose here, but what we did was to study this and then present the data and present an understanding in the text and also in the wall mural itself of the development of the poverty line and the relative poverty threshold as opposed to an official poverty. And if you if one looks at the official poverty threshold in the US, it would be about 12% or 12.7% people living in poverty. But if one understands poverty in a relative way, which most other countries in the world do, then it would be about double that. So it would be about 25% living in poverty. The idea with the piece, though, was really to situate this timeline, right, from the inception of the poverty line to the present. And it was 40 feet long, so that people would walk along this landscape that was made by comparing this kind of landscape by comparing the official poverty and relative poverty, and to read also about the increasing, at that time dramatically increasing, gap between wealthy and poor, and the consolidation of wealth in the U.S. In the top percentile, and how that had grown over the 70s and 80s, etc. And so what this meant was that as you walked along the line, or along the wall mural, this kind of supersizing of statistical information and explanation, one would kind of immerse in the understanding of the poverty line and get a sense of also where they stood on that. And the project Social Landscape as a visual was then visible from other galleries. So it was also the idea of kind of bringing in this economic data into the galleries of the museum, right? So that you would see that while you're looking at other works as well in a background. And then Martin and I have also done a number of exhibition designs and continue to do that here and there. And exhibition design is appealing to us because our work together has often kind of formulated around architectural histories of display, and working with display itself. And exhibition design gives us a chance to work on certain ideas, and again, thinking about materializing, let's say, a curator's notion of a subject and the ingredients that they're showing, and materializing that into a visual context of the exhibition. So this one, Rise of the Picture Press, was made by, the curator was Christopher Phillips, and this was done, wait, I have to look back, was done in 2000 at International Center for Photography. The exhibition was solely made up of newspapers and magazines that are ephemera from the period of the 1920s and 30s. And what the exhibition was doing was exploring this period when photography and graphic design were influenced by the explosion of printed matter and periodicals, and bringing that into a kind of history through the ephemeral material. What we wanted to do was to activate that material, but not in a vitrine way. We wanted to, make it more present, say, and not to sequester the material into vitrines, and to turn it into something that would be a very lively display that also reflected the period that it was talking about, right? So often Martin and I are taking cues, and I'm doing that in other work as well, taking cues or clues from the subject matter that is, the source of study or the source of interest, and then using those principles or clues to come up with visual solutions and formal solutions sometimes. So this show was inspired by looking at two things. One was Herbert Bayer's field of vision diagram from 1930, which is this. So what our task was to take all these newspapers and magazines, archival material, and present them in a way that would be protected but also active, right, for the viewer. So we adopted this, on the one hand, this field of vision from Herbert Bayer, and that's from the same period, 1930. And since it was contemporaneous, we wanted to use it as a kind of display apparatus, right, or the idea of it. And then also we thought about the newsstand from the Times, right, and how we could emulate the notion of a newsstand in the display. So it's really about angles, right, and then coming up with a very, say, inexpensive solution to emulate that. And then another example of exhibition design, this is Changing Channels from last year, Artists in Television, again deals with this notion of when making an exhibition, but when the things that are being exhibited are not objects and not very tangible and need to be materialized in a sense in an exhibition hall. So this exhibition consisted solely of videotapes and a couple of, or a few actually, video installations and film installations. And our job then was to think about how we could take this massive amount of time-based media, videos to be viewed, and make an environment that was inviting for viewers to spend time in, and also articulate some of the concepts of that the curator was interested in even taking up this issue of artists using television as a kind of social form, and beginning in the 60s. So in this case, we're making a field, say, to show these works, and thought about using color bars as benches, or working with the color bars of the television, and putting those into play in these benches that people would then watch the videos on, and also listing the titles of the works and the names of the artists in very large letters to also create something like an index of concerns that you would see as you walked into the exhibition. And as you can see, a lot of the exhibitions that I've worked on, that Group Material worked on, and that Martin and I designed, I think they have there's a threshold idea to it, that you walk into an exhibition and you cross a threshold into another kind of space, and where display is a very strong element sometimes, and in some cases I think they're very totalizing, which is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but they, this design can be seen as a kind of totalizing design. At the same time, it's intended to really create an environment for the viewer to learn more also about the work that they're looking at. As I'm buzzing along, I'm not keeping an eye on the time, or if there are any questions that people have as I go. Are there any questions that are immediate to some of the things I've been talking about? Or should I just keep? Okay, I'll keep going. So this is now leading into, that gives you I don't know if it seems very fragmented to me. It seems all very congruent with each other. But this gives you a superficial maybe sense of the ways I've been the different ways I've been working, the different forms that I work with or continue to work with, exhibition and publication primarily, and how maybe exhibition and publication can feed each other. Because I've also been thinking of the publication as a form that is an exhibition in a sense, right? And for many years, exhibition was really the primary medium that I had a passion for. I wouldn't say it's quite that way now, and I have more of a passion at the moment for working in the publication sphere. But I've taken a lot of the thinking that was developed in Group Material, that I've developed since, and also thinking through exhibition ideas with Martin, and then applying that into a publication form. Just like, I'll go back just slightly to show you that, or to point out that something like the Carita and Donald Moffat show, I think was, whoa, it's way back. Sorry, I'll go faster. Yeah, the Carita and Donald Moffat show is an example where I was thinking everything that could go in a publication, or that would normally, or let's say conventionally be relegated to a publication, contextual information about the artists and information maybe that I had come across in my research that illuminated the way the artists were working and what they were doing. That would normally maybe go in an essay, go into a publication, and I decided with this exhibition I wanted to bring it into the exhibition itself. So you see artworks like the prints on the walls, right? And in Moffat's case, there's also light works and prints on the walls, not so visible here, but with that, I'm also combining quotations from the artists and other material that I've come across, documentation material that illuminates their processes and practices and the things that they were speaking to, and then brought that into the exhibition on these kind of very, on these display surfaces or these fixtures that function as extra display and also as, in this case, even as seating, so that people are immersed into the environment of the investigation of the subject matter. And so I had this idea for a long time. It was also in cultural economies and other projects where I wanted to kind of conflate the exhibition and the publication, and within an exhibition space. And then now I've been working in a reverse way almost, and saying I want to bring the exhibition thinking into publication and turn the publication into something that exhibits in a certain way, right? And also, visually exhibits. So the thing that I wanted to talk about, other than this introduction, is that recently I finished my doctoral research at Malmö Art Academy, and that's part of Lund University. And I was studying specifically with Sarat Maharaj and Gertrude Sandquist. And the investigation, or the doctoral work, was intended, for me, was intended to have a 4-year period where I could research and work in an independent way without a lot of expectations or like kind of institutional limitations, or the idea that it's going to result in an exhibition or a book, but that I could work more freely and also then figure out from investigating a subject matter what forms would lend themselves, what forms could I work with for that. So the larger investigation is about archiving and historical representation. The project as a whole is called Remembering and Forgetting in the Archive, Instituting Group Material 1979 to 1996. The Remembering and Forgetting in the Archive, as the larger title, references this conceptual field of study, and then Instituting Group Material as a subtitle is about the empirical testing ground, right? So I was interested in really looking at how to introduce group material, which had been this ephemeral nomadic practice that didn't leave a lot of traces, and how to introduce that into the archive, how to archive it, but also how to introduce it into social histories and art history in a sense, and with what means. So investigating the means to and consequences of registering previously unhistoricized art field events and practices into records, and seeing how art history in a sense could be expanded and affected was one of the overarching ideas of the PhD research. I also wanted to test particular methods of historical representation that draw from the archive, which you'll see more in the book, and to test the permeability of the archive, and by extension test the permeability of history, right? For instance, something like Sister Carita, that's the book that I did a few years ago, was the first book that's come out on her work, and this has helped to broadcast her work. And one of the effects of that, Carita is, her work is just infectious. People are really, happy to learn about it, and the book has now gone into third printing, and there are a lot of, and I'm not saying that I did this or something, but there's a real enthusiasm around Sister Carita's work. And although she was quite well known in the 60s, she had more or less receded from public visibility in the aftermath of that. And so the book was able to, with the book form, I was able to kind of rebroadcast her work. But one of the things that happened with that too, with all the enthusiasm around Carita, is that her work is now being registered into the pop canon, in a sense, right? And as a pop artist. And in the study that I was doing in the PhD, I'm also interested in seeing if you register these kind of previously unhistoricized practices, and in some cases, historically marginalized practices, into art history, what gets amputated from those practices as they enter that, right? And can something like Sister Reader or group material, can it exist in a historical form now that does justice to the complexity of the practices, right? And in group materials case, it's complicated because it was a collaborative practice, and it involves a lot of people also. So there's a kind of tricky terrain in navigating that. But to go further with what the PhD research is about, also looking into the archive and how the archive, in a larger, more overarching sense of archive, how it institutes both remembering and forgetting, right? It's a place that we relegate history and memory in a certain sense, but it's also a place where we store or put things. And I wanted to look at the archive and really think about it as an active apparatus of recollection, right? And it's something that's operational. And from the archive is important, or became very important to me over the last few years, because it's from the archive that the written record emerges, right? And also as the written record emerges, it was, for instance, like the book on Creator or the book on group material, that also produces more archive, right? And the idea of the archive as something that's really a container, I think is somewhat misleading, because archive, of course, is endlessly uncontainable and is in a constant kind of reproductive state as we add to it, right? And the other thing I was interested in doing in the PhD was to really think about, and this is for people that are maybe interested in going deeper into the practice, to think about and analyze the liberties and the limitations of both of these forms, exhibition and publication, right, as presentational forms for historical research. So that's something that I go into quite in depth in the PhD, or the critical writing of that. So a testing of both archiving practice and historical representation then gets carried out in the arms of cohering and instituting the group material archive and the book itself. And the book Show and Tell, a Chronicle of Group Material, was intended in the PhD to provide a kind of demonstration, like an analytic situation for the problematics of archiving and history writing. But more importantly, it was intended to register group material in the public sphere as something that could continue to create affinities from its work, and to further social action and aesthetic action, etc. And also as a way to articulate the group, to the former members of the group. I'll give you a little bit of the background, or a view into the book, the way that the book is structured, and talk about that a little. After group material had disbanded in 1996, we continued, some of the former members, myself and Doug Ashford, who was a long-term member, had continued to represent group material through live narration and also through writings and different kinds of presentations. But I was, as the only founding member who stayed to the end of group material, I also felt a certain responsibility and wanted to keep recounting the group, but also felt a responsibility in terms of cohering its historical representation, or the first iteration of that, right? When group material ceased its activities in 1996, because we had been temporal practice and nomadic, etc., and because of the politics or the cultural politics that was involved in group material's work, we kind of resisted the idea of a book, for instance, or an exhibition about group material, and we resisted the idea of objectification and packaging, say, this history. And in particular, I resisted it because I liked the idea of group material remaining ephemeral, right, just as its practice had been. And I thought that there was a kind of radical dimension to that. But then over time, over the 13 years between the group ending and starting to work on this, there continued to be a lot of interest in group material, and it became clear that there was really no reason to resist as long as we could have some kind of say over the first writing of our own history or so. So 3 years ago, I thought it was time, 3 or 4 years ago, it was really time to relinquish that and to embark on the book project. And initially, when we talked about doing a book project, it came out of the archive. And all the former members that are around and invested in group material had some of the papers, the paper trail, the image trail in their apartments. I had a lot of the paper trail, and Doug Ashford also had a lot, and we decided then to consolidate this and to cohere it into one collection and to put it into a formal archive, which was identified as the best place being NYU, the Downtown Collection, which is a wonderful collection it's an archive of overlapping collections of individual artists and group structures and across different media and disciplines, but looking at downtown culture in New York as a very fertile environment, and how did it co-produce these different manifestations. So while working on this notion of archiving group material and doing that in a very concrete way, like taking all the material and putting it together and looking at it and thinking out how to structure the archive. But it was a chance to actually read everything again and look through what we had, look through the evidentiary traces. And during that process, it became clear that it was necessary and important to make a book project. So the idea was to use the archive material, or to use those material traces as also the way that the histories could be told, right? So the book really came out of the archiving, and I think this was what was very interesting about the process that I was doing, which was to be able to archive and work on the articulation of group materials history at the same time was an opportunity to also see the co-production, the kind of dynamic between archiving and history writing. The book has a very specific structure. We structured as a chronicle, and begins. I'm only going to. Actually, I might go to another. Now I'll just show you a few pages of it, but it has a chronicle, so it traces the beginning of the group and goes to the last of the activities, which is in 1996. And within that chronicle are articulated a number of narratives, right? The narrative of the development of the group and the process of the group, the interactions of the group in its various stages, the intentions of the work and the intentions of the overall practice, and also things like economic factors. How did we pay for this? How did it take a formation? What was the economy that we were in? How did we function? There were a lot of practical issues that are brought to bear. There's also a kind of running narrative throughout the chronicle about the let's say arguments or dissenting and clashes within the process of collaboration. And the way that group material gets shown and told through the book is through images that are both snapshots and also installation photography, through original documents, which include, in this case, minutes of meetings that we had, and also I only have a couple of examples on this PowerPoint, but let's see, different kind of documents that group material made, so that you actually hear the kind of voice of the group in its original language, right? What we thought we were doing at the time, rather than another voice talking about this is what group material did, or taking a more distanced view. And then there's also, in addition to that, there's this yellow bar that runs through the Chronicle. And within that, there's this kind of guiding voice. I think of it as a guiding voice, which tells in a very present tense mode what was going on at each moment, you know, and tells anecdotes. It supplies information also that the voice supplies information that would otherwise not be available through looking at documents, through looking at documentation of the projects. But sometimes it's things like, okay, Group Material just got its NEA funding, and that funding, we got a grant for, or let's say Group Material got a grant for $5,000 in 1980, and the guiding voice would tell this anecdote about how the very first grant that Group Material got was actually withheld by Frank Hodsell, who was the director of the National Endowment, because the gallery or the exhibition space that we had red walls, and he had heard that we had red walls and thought that we were communists. And this is the kind of thing, it's like someone from the group has to really tell that. You know, it's not information that's recorded anywhere. There are a lot of bits of information like that that then filter through this narration of the guiding text. And the guiding text is also told in a present tense manner. I have to open a book, actually, if I want to read anything to you. But rather than using, you know, the like I or they, it speaks in a present tense fashion and does not speak from a single perspective, but instead it's difficult to tell from the mode who's speaking, and that's intentional to draw on this notion of the collective, and that the guiding text is also a kind of a consolidation or a collaboration between different people's memories and bits of information. So that present tense mode is something like October 1981, Group Material distributes a flyer, caution, whoa. God, what happened?
It's because your book hit the volume up.
Oh, God. Sorry about that. So, volume down.
Be careful not to hit that.
Okay. Group Material it's a little loud though. Is this better? Or is it still too loud? Group Material distributes a flyer, Caution Alternative Space, in downtown Uptown, an exhibition by 17 Lower Manhattan-based alternative spaces at the City Gallery in New York. The handout explains the problems that emerged during the group's first year, which led to leaving 13th Street to develop a new practice based around distribution and employing public spaces. In addition to planning projects for city squares, newspapers, and mass transit, the group begins to use Tim and Julie's living room at 132 East 26th Street as a headquarters for meetings and occasional exhibitions, and discusses getting new members. Jock Reynolds conducts a site visit to 26th Street on behalf of the National Endowment for the Arts in response to the group's funding application. After a few minutes of pretending to be professional and established, the ad hoc character of the setup is apparent to Reynolds, who proposes a candid conversation over a couple of six-packs. He is supportive and offers good advice. So there's this kind of, you know, it's like a telling in the present tense of what's going on, and this is intended to situate the viewer or the reader in the present tense, so that when you're reading it, you're not thinking about the past, but it helps to situate in a vivid situation. Is it still too loud? Okay. I have to be careful. There's a lot of buttons here. I have to be careful not to press. The key challenge, of course, or one of the key challenges with figuring out how to present something like how to make the group material book, was how to structure, what methods to use and what structure to use that would animate the subject of group material and its practice without excessively controlling its meanings, right? So that's one of the reasons that I was interested in in this kind of documentary mode rather than an interpretive mode for the book. And so the book doesn't really interpret what group material was about or why it did what it did, other than to situate in the immediate documents, which, for instance, a press release or an internal document of the group would give a sense of those, of the logic and the motivations. But it doesn't give this kind of overarching voice that looks back on things and says, this is what group material was about. The reason it doesn't do that, or the reason I didn't want to do that, is in order to create a situation with the book where the viewer and the readers are the historians, in a sense, right? They're making the sense of the material that's being put forward. And to leave it open-ended in a sense that one can come into the group material book and be interested on any number of levels and not be told this is what it should be or this is what group material was primarily about. Because group material has been, could be seen through a number of lenses, but has been talked about as an activist organization. It's been looked at as a curatorial endeavor. It's been talked about in lots of different ways, and I think it's important that the representation of the group and its practice be something that is open-ended in the way and inviting people in on their own, by their own means of association, in a way that the group material exhibition practice was, right? So that in our exhibitions as well, you would never find something like a wall text or a statement or a declarative. The exhibitions were forums of information which were up to the viewer to really navigate and also develop their own relationships too, based on whatever they're carrying. And so the idea for how to deal with that in the book, this kind of non-interpretive mode also, or not heavy-handed mode, and more of a vivid telling and sharing of information, had very much to do with the principles of how group material spoke in its original work, right, as well. The main section of the book is the Chronicle. That's about 200 pages. And if I want to show you more of the book, I have to actually get out of this PDF, which I think I'm going to do, just because I really want to give you the visual flavor. It's not a PDF, it's just an electronic version of the book. So I'm just going to flip through without explaining a lot, other than that the layers become, I think, quite evident. This Chronicle is 200 pages, and it gives a sense of the internal workings of the group through this documentation. Also gives the guiding text, and also has documentation of the projects. So this relation between the inside and the outside, so to speak, is very important. There are long documents, internal communiques in the book. I might actually read a moment from some of that to get a sense of that, but I'll keep going. And then there are these magenta texts, which are extracts from other documents, sometimes things that were written about group material. So you get a sense of the reception at the time of the projects, and then sometimes they're more internal. There's documents like when group material first started, we put this out, who, what, where, when, how, a kind of self-representation of the project. And then, in many cases, there are also installation shots of exhibitions, and I also, in the editing process, try to include images of each of the members of group material and the different formations of the group, so that one looking through the book would come away also with the notion that the understanding that group material, like any ongoing kind of entity, is not monolithic, but is a series of formations and made up of a number of social bodies, in a sense, as the collaboration changed over time. So I'll flip through this. The main section of the Chronicle is then followed by several essays. So the Chronicle is coming in at a very ground level, right? Using the material traces to tell about group material. And it's coming in at this level also, it's like a kind of vantage point where it's very direct and not an aerial view. That's Mundy, the one who's doing the thing, and Doug is on the top, and then Tim, and me on the other side. The other thing is that group material often used timelines as a form in an exhibition format. And the Chronicle, of course, is very different from the timeline, but it's related to that. And thinking of the Chronicle not as a strict kind of device so much as a organizing principle or an organizing device in the book, but then one can come in at any point. You can open the book at any point and dig into either a certain project or a moment in the process. And I think that's very important to the book also, is that it's decentralized, right? And the way that the exhibitions were decentralized, that the book also has that. And that's another reason, like going for that kind of decentralized mode is another reason not to have the overarching narrator voice, but instead have this guiding or idea of someone standing nearby and telling you like secrets about the group or things about the group.